You know how sometimes life surprises you when you least expect it. That one summer morning, I was just planning to catch some sun by the pool. Nothing fancy, just a little quiet time to myself. But when I stepped outside, he was already there. My husband's friend, sitting by the pool, waiting for me. What happened next wasn't anything I could have predicted. It shook something awake in me I hadn't felt in years, and I've been thinking about it every day since. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy stories that stir your emotions and make you feel something real, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. It means the world to me and helps this community grow. Now let me take you back to that moment, because it's a story I'll never forget. It was late June, and the sun had just started rising above the trees that line our backyard. I remember the way the light shimmered off the water in the pool like it was made of glass. The whole yard was quiet except for the hum of the pool filter and the occasional chirp of a morning bird. I had slipped into my light blue robe, hair still damp from my shower, and stepped outside with my coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than solitude. But he was already there. Brian, my husband's oldest friend. They'd gone to college together, played racquetball every Tuesday, and cracked inside jokes I never understood. He was the type who always showed up unannounced but never overstayed, charming in an offhand kind of way. I liked him, but he wasn't someone I'd ever spent time alone with. Not really. And yet there he was, barefoot, sitting at the edge of the pool in khaki shorts and a white polo shirt, legs dangling into the water like he belonged there. A bottle of orange juice rested on the ground beside him. He turned when he heard the sliding door click behind me. "Morning," he said, smiling in that easy way he always did. I blinked. "Brian, what are you doing here? Mike's not home." "I know," he said. "He told me he had to leave early. Said I could hang out here until he gets back from his meeting." He looked at me for a second, maybe longer than necessary, and then back at the water. "Didn't expect you to be up this early." "Didn't expect company," I said, stepping onto the patio and pulling my robe tighter. There was a moment of quiet. Not awkward, just still. The kind you don't notice until it stretches too long. I sat down on a lounger across from him, the fabric warm under my legs. I took a sip of my coffee and tried to ignore how aware I suddenly was of my robe's neckline. Brian leaned back on his hands and looked around. "This place really is peaceful in the mornings." "Yeah," I said. "I like it best before everything wakes up." "Mike ever sit out here with you?" I raised an eyebrow. "Not really. He's not much of a morning person." Brian gave a soft chuckle. "Figures. He never was. Even in college, I'd be up brewing coffee, and he'd still be buried under the covers." I smiled, but something about the way he looked at me lingered, like he was searching for something just under the surface. "You've got a good thing here," he said quietly. "The house, the yard, the quiet. You seem grounded." I shifted in my seat. "Thanks, I guess. It's not perfect, but it's home." "Is it enough?" he asked, looking at me again. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but I could tell it wasn't casual. "I don't know. You just seem like someone who's holding a lot in, like you've got more going on than you let people see." I swallowed. That's a strange thing to say. "I didn't mean to pry," he said, his voice softer now. "It's just, sometimes you see things, in people, things they don't say." I set my coffee down on the side table, suddenly feeling exposed. "You think you know me that well?" Brian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "No, but I'd like to." His words hung in the air between us, heavier than they should have been. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not just my husband's friend, but a man sitting across from me who saw things most people didn't. It was disarming. "You're being awfully reflective for 8 in the morning," I said, trying to break the tension. He smiled, but his eyes didn't lose that intensity. "Maybe it's the water. Always makes me think." I stood up, feeling the need to move, to shift the energy. "I was going to go for a swim. You're welcome to join me." He nodded slowly. "I'd like that." I walked to the edge of the pool and untied my robe. Underneath, I wore a simple black one-piece swimsuit, not revealing, not flashy, but I still felt his gaze as I slipped into the water. It was warm, welcoming. I dunked my head under and let the weight of the morning sink off my shoulders. When I surfaced, Brian had stepped in. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention to himself, but he filled the space with presence. He swam closer, not invading, just near enough. "I forgot how good this feels," he said. "It's been years since I swam in a private pool." I nodded. "It's easy to forget what you enjoy." We floated for a while in silence, occasionally brushing against each other. Not on purpose, not exactly by accident either. Then he asked, "Are you happy, really?" That question again, and this time I didn't brush it off. "I think I am," I said honestly. "Most days." He looked at me, and his voice was gentle. "And the other days?" I hesitated. I don't always know. We stayed in the water like that for a while. Two people who weren't supposed to be having a conversation this deep, this early on a random Tuesday morning. But there we were. When I finally stepped out of the pool, wrapping my robe around me again, Brian stayed in the water, arms resting on the edge, watching me, not in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel seen. "I should make breakfast," I said. "Can I help?" I paused. Sure. Why not? As we walked inside, the sun climbing higher behind us, I couldn't help but feel like something had shifted. A thread had been pulled, something unraveling quietly beneath the surface. And I didn't know yet if I was ready to follow it, but I knew I felt alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon dish soap and cinnamon from the candles I lit the night before. Brian followed me in, still damp from the pool, his shirt clinging to his back. I was hyper-aware of his presence, how he moved, how close he stood behind me when I opened the fridge. It wasn't tense exactly, but something unspoken was definitely hanging in the air. "You've got eggs, some spinach, and is this smoked salmon?" he asked, holding up the vacuum-sealed pack like it was some kind of treasure. I laughed. "Yes, chef. Are you planning a gourmet breakfast?" He grinned. "You just watch. I've got skills." We moved around each other like we'd done this 100 times before. He sautéed onions and spinach while I whisked the eggs. I set the table, threw in some toast, and made a fresh pot of coffee. It all felt oddly intimate. Not romantic, not yet, just familiar in a way that made me question why it felt so easy. He plated everything with surprising care and set the dishes down like we were in a quiet café, not my suburban kitchen. We sat across from each other at the small breakfast table near the window. Outside, the pool shimmered under the rising sun. Inside, something between us was beginning to glow quiet and steady. "So," I said between bites, "are you going to explain this morning's philosophical mood?" He shrugged, chewing slowly. "I've just been thinking lately. About life. About what we chase. What we ignore." I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like something a man says before making a drastic life change. He chuckled. "Maybe I'm due for one." There was a pause. I set my fork down, took a sip of coffee, and looked at him. "What is it you think I'm ignoring?" I asked. Brian leaned back in his chair and studied me. not in a judgmental way, more like he was searching for the truth buried in my expression. "I think you've gotten really good at taking care of everyone else," he said. "Mike, your son, this house. But I don't think anyone's been taking care of you. Not really." His words hit somewhere deep inside me. I didn't flinch, but I felt it. That tug. "That's a big assumption," I said softly. "Maybe," he replied, "but I've known you a long time, even if we haven't spent much time like this, and I see it in your eyes. You've got the look of someone who's tired of being invisible." I blinked, the truth of it almost too raw to admit. "I'm not invisible." "You're not," he said gently, "but you feel like you are." And there it was. I didn't know whether to thank him or tell him to leave. I'd lived so long in this quiet rhythm. Wake up, care for the house, support Mike, plan the meals, manage the little pieces of life no one ever notices unless they're missing. And I hadn't even realized how long it had been since someone really looked at me. Brian did, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. After breakfast, we washed the dishes together. Hands brushed. A few quiet glances exchanged. We weren't saying everything, but our silence was full of meaning. "I should head out," he said eventually, trying his hands. I nodded. "Of course. I'm sure Mike will call you when he's done." He didn't move right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know," he said, voice low, "I always wondered what would have happened if I met you first." The words hit like a jolt, quick, electric, unexpected. "Brian?" I know," he said quickly, hands raised in surrender. That was probably out of line. I've watched you for years, admired you. From the sidelines." I didn't know what to say. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment, but from a confusing mixture of validation, longing, and something else I wasn't ready to name. "You should go," I said finally, not angry, just overwhelmed. He nodded. "I'll see myself out." As he stepped past me, he paused. "You deserve to be seen, Rachel. Don't forget that." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the air too still. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee cup half full, eggs cold on my plate, heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I did the laundry, trimmed some of the hedges, fed the cat. Everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. Later that evening, Mike came home, tired, distracted, kicked his shoes off at the door and dropped his keys on the counter. "How was your day?" he asked, barely looking up. I smiled faintly. "Quiet. Just stayed home." He nodded. "Brian said he stopped by." "Yeah," I said. "He waited by the pool. Thought he'd be back sooner." "Typical," Mike muttered. "He always just shows up." And that was the end of it. No suspicion. No questions. No idea. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Brian said, what he saw in me. And for the first time in years, I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to see it too. The reflection staring back was a woman who'd been everything for everyone else, but didn't know who she was anymore. Until that morning. Something had been stirred, and I wasn't sure I wanted to put it back to sleep. The days that followed were complicated. I went about my routine like always. Grocery runs, garden maintenance, a charity board meeting I half listened to. But everything felt like it was coated in a thin film of distraction. My thoughts kept drifting back to Brian. Not in a romantic, daydreamy way. It was subtler than that. Quieter. He'd nudged something open in me, something I wasn't even aware had been locked. The mornings by the pool became my sanctuary. I'd take my coffee out just after sunrise, let the silence wrap around me like a shawl, and think about my life, my marriage, my identity outside of those roles. Mike noticed I was quieter, but he didn't press. He never had. That was part of our rhythm, too. Comfortable distance. Predictable kindness. But little intimacy. Our conversations stayed surface level. Safe. 3 days after Brian had come by, I received a text from him. "Hope I didn't cross a line the other day. Been thinking about it a lot." I stared at the message for a long time. I could have ignored it. Should have, maybe. But I didn't. It was unexpected, but honest. I appreciate that. He replied a few minutes later. "Would you meet me for coffee? Somewhere neutral. Just to talk." I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the screen. I wasn't trying to start anything, but I couldn't deny that a conversation with someone who actually saw me felt like air after being underwater. So I said yes. We met at a cafe on the edge of town. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of place where no one knew your name and didn't care if you stayed too long. Brian was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees, one black, one with a touch of cream. "You remembered," I said as I sat down, gesturing toward the cup. "Of course," he said with a half smile. "You always take cream, no sugar." We sat in silence for a few moments, both sipping and avoiding eye contact like teenagers. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," he said eventually. "You're married. I respect that. I just couldn't keep quiet anymore." I looked at him, really looked this time. His face had the softness of a man who'd weathered some storms, a touch of silver at his temples, and eyes that carried more history than he let on. "You made me feel seen," I said, and I didn't realize how much I needed that. He exhaled, visibly relieved. "I'm not trying to interfere, Rachel, but I want you to know, you deserve to feel alive. Not just functional." "I used to feel alive," I said, voice low. "Before the years blurred together. Before everything I did became habit instead of choice." Brian reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. Just a touch, nothing overt, but it sent a tremor up my arm. "You still can," he said. "You haven't disappeared. You've just been quiet." That line stayed with me long after we left. I didn't go home right away. I parked near the lake and sat there for an hour, watching the water shimmer in the wind. Something inside me was shifting, slowly, carefully. That evening, Mike was on a work call in the den. I sat on the back patio with a glass of wine, listening to the cicadas hum. I thought about all the roles I played: wife, mother, hostess, organizer, and I wondered when I'd last done something just for me. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the pool again. But this time, I didn't bring my coffee. I didn't bring anything. I just stood there, until I slipped off my robe and dove in. No hesitation. The water wrapped around me like a memory. I swam until my arms ached, until I could no longer tell if I was chasing something or trying to escape it. When I finally emerged, breathless and soaked, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. That same afternoon, Brian texted again. "Can I see you? Just talk. Nothing more. I promise." I waited a while before responding. Then I said yes. We met at a public park this time. Open space, no shadows to hide in. We walked. No destination. Just movement. He didn't push. Didn't ask for anything. He just listened as I talked. About my life, about Mike, about how I'd fallen into the rhythm of being everything for everyone else and somehow lost myself along the way. "I don't want to blow up my life," I said, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. "But I can't keep pretending that I'm whole when I'm not." Brian stopped walking. He turned toward me, searching my face. "You're allowed to want more. That doesn't make you selfish." "I don't even know what more looks like," I'd whispered. He reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. Maybe it starts with someone reminding you that you matter, that your happiness matters. I stood there, caught in the warmth of his gaze, and for a brief second, I forgot everything else, the years, the commitments, the expectations. And then the moment passed. I stepped back. I should go. He didn't argue, just nodded. Whenever you want to talk, I'm here. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mike lay beside me, snoring softly, his arm limp across his chest. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how easy it is to become invisible in your own life. How easy it is to forget that you once had dreams that didn't revolve around someone else. Brian hadn't given me those feelings. He just reminded me they were still in me. Waiting. Still breathing. Still hoping. The following week unfolded like a string pulled too tight. Tense, quiet, ready to snap. I kept moving through my life like normal. I made dinner. I called my sister. I watered the plants and took the car in for its overdue oil change. But under it all, I was carrying a weight I didn't know how to put down. And not because of Brian, not exactly. It was more like he'd lit a fuse to something I'd buried deep. One night, Mike and I were sitting on the couch watching a rerun of a crime show he liked. He laughed at something the detective said, reached over, and squeezed my knee. "Remember when we used to stay up late watching these?" he asked, smiling like it was still the same. I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Yeah," I said. "We used to talk about them for hours." He nodded. "We should do that again sometime." But I knew we wouldn't. And it wasn't his fault. It wasn't even mine. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being curious about each other. And that was the thing I couldn't ignore anymore. A few days later, I was in the garden pulling weeds when Brian texted me again. "No pressure. Just wondering how you're doing." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. It wasn't the words. It was the feeling behind them. Thoughtfulness. Interest. A kind of emotional presence I hadn't felt in years. I typed and erased my reply twice, then finally sent, "Can we talk? I need air." He offered to pick me up, but I said no. I needed to walk, to feel the ground under my feet. We met at the same park as before, under the shade of an old oak tree near the edge of the pond. The breeze was gentle. It smelled like spring water and freshly cut grass. "I'm scared," I said before he could speak. "Not of you. Of what this means. Of what it might change." Brian didn't move closer. He didn't touch me. He just listened. "You don't have to make any decisions today," he said, "or tomorrow. I just want to be here for whatever you need, even if it's just a place to say the things you're not allowed to say out loud." I turned to him, tears threatening to slip. I don't know who I am without being Mike's wife, without being the woman who makes everything run smoothly, the one who's always stable, predictable. "You're still her," Brian said, "but you're more than her. You're someone with thoughts and needs and passion. You're someone who deserves to feel." The tears came then, quiet but persistent. He stepped closer, slowly, gently. Then, without asking, he opened his arms, and I let myself fall into them. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't lustful. It was human. His embrace was steady, strong, like a pause in the chaos. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just breathing. Eventually, I pulled back. He didn't ask for anything, didn't suggest anything. That meant more to me than anything he could have said. "I don't know what happens next," I whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Promise you won't forget this moment, that you'll remember what it feels like to be heard." I nodded. We parted ways at the edge of the path. He watched me walk to my car, but didn't follow. Didn't text after. When I got home, I went straight to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of my nightstand. Inside was a small journal I hadn't written in for over a decade. I flipped it open and started to write. Not about Brian. Not even about Mike. About me. About the girl I used to be, the woman I had become, and the woman I wanted to grow into now, not for anyone else. For myself. That night, as I lay beside Mike, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel shame. I felt awake. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe I'd never meet Brian again, not like that. But I would remember the way it felt to be seen, to be asked the questions no one else dared ask, to swim in my own pool and feel alive again, to remember that life wasn't over just because you'd lived most of it for others. In some quiet, beautiful way, I had begun again, and that made all the difference.